particle effects. This is the final version of the game. So it's a lot more shiny to start with, but also the lighting is improved, the frame rate is improved. It's a little bit jumpy with all the re-encoding here. But the lighting, the frame rate, the rendering is all improved on the final version of the game. And what we will look at is one more video. Not this one though. Oh, actually no, this is fine. Yeah, we will look at this. Sorry. Sorry, Dave. So this is some excerpts of some of the final levels, basically showing them off. That was London we saw before. This is the Halliday Forest. This is Dover. As you can see, one thing we're going to talk about in a minute is there are still some frame rate pauses here. Right? Although generally the frame rate is better, there's still some jerking in here, which we'll talk about in a minute. But basically, this is all about final terrains in the game. We ended up building something like 8 or 9 terrains, and using them over the 14 missions. No terrain here; it's just water. So, what went wrong? This is the traditional part of the post-mortem. Obviously, you guys have seen how the development kind of progressed from the start to the end. So, we'll just talk quickly about the key points of what it was that meant that the development played out the way it did. First thing here, production and planning. The original scope and the goals didn't match the budget. You can tell that straight off. Trying to do a game where you're developing a whole new engine, a whole new tool set, same scope as the previous game, but more missions, more multiplayer, more of everything, with just 50% more budget in the same amount of development time was crazy things. Full production started without the engine and the tools in place. As you saw, we were at 30 months before the engine and the tool set were even marginally mature. And it wasn't until later than that they were fully usable. The lack of a terrain tool was probably the thing that contributed most to not having to the reduction in scope across the course of the project from start to finish. Next thing that went wrong, engine and programming. Basically, Heroes of the Pacific, when we started that game, as I said, everything was done kind of on the smell of an oily rag. It used renderware as its engine, and unfortunately, late in the development or shortly after, EA bought Criterion. Now, EA promised that they were going to keep developing renderware, but that turned out not to be true. So we started this project without an engine, and we started without a tool. In fact, in Heroes of the Pacific, we purchased an existing tool off another developer that we'd worked on at that developer. So we had a tool framework that we just changed slightly to suit what we needed to do in Heroes of the Pacific. In Heroes of Europe, we created our whole own tool set that took us 30 months to get work for. Finally, the key engine features were still missing right towards the end of the project, right up to alpha and beta, and that's the things like optimization, streaming, memory management, all those things that basically gave us the performance and the stability that we needed at the end, but we didn't have them until very late in the development. Next thing here, deferred rendering. I already mentioned how terrible an idea it is. And in this case, this is part of, it's kind of symptomatic of one of the problems with the project early on, where it was really, the program was not to single them out, but they really got caught up in a lot of technologies. And one of the technologies was deferred rendering. And I think early on in the project, I think it was Killzone 2 had released a white paper about deferred rendering. I was getting a nod from the back, and we had a huge kind of show and tell at work about this awesome thing called deferred rendering, and suddenly it was the hot new technology, and it was automatically it was put into Hero, but it was a really bad idea for us. It didn't suit the game. It didn't suit one of our platforms that we were making the game on. And ultimately, we spent 2 months removing it from the game later, and having to do that to increase performance. So it was good for one platform, bad for the other, and it was a bad idea all around for us. The next thing that we're talking about now, I talked about those frame rate stalls that you saw in the videos, and basically those are caused by the cascading shadow maps that we used in the game. Cascading shadow maps is another technology which does dynamic real-time shadows off objects. So it renders all of the objects into a shadow map and then renders that onto the scene. And it does that in real time. Now we could have used pre-baked shadow, but there was a point in the project where we were trying to decide between pre-baked shadows and dynamic shadows from the CSM, the cascading shadow map. And at this stage, we weren't actually sure whether we were going to be able to fit pre-baked shadows onto the disc. Now, it's not a problem on the PS3 because you've got a Blu-ray disc, you've got plenty of gigs on it. But the Xbox, you've got a dual-layer DVD, and you don't get access to all 9 gigabit. You get about 6 and a bit gig on the Xbox. And we thought that with all of our game data, with all of our VOs, with all of our videos, we wouldn't have enough room on the disc to actually store the pre-generated shadows. We also thought that we have destructible buildings and destructible trees in the game all the way through it, and we thought that we couldn't use the pre-baked shadows because they wouldn't represent the destructibility of the entities on them. As it turns out, nobody even noticed that you could blow up the buildings and the trees, and nobody cared either. So we should have gone with pre-baked shadows. The reason the CSMs cost us so much is, well, there's not enough memory for them. So in the beta version, the cascading shadow maps were really kind of jaggy and low res. We improved that later when we switched to forward rendering because we could afford more memory for them. They also take a long time to render, and that was the cause of the frame rate drops we saw. And we were never actually able to solve that on all of the platforms. We still were getting stalled when the performance was marginal. Like when we're only just achieving 30, if a cascading shadow map needed to generate, we'd lose a frame for it. So that ended up giving us the stalls that we saw. The other thing is that cascading shadow maps are generally good in things like first-person shooters where your range of movement, your view angle changes in a predictable way and it doesn't change through the axes quite much. In heroes and dogfighting games, you're moving erratically, and that kind of erratic movement means that the cascading shadow maps need to be regenerated far too quickly, and we couldn't afford to regenerate them all the time. And I'm adamant that you can still, in the final game, move erratically enough to cause glitches in the cascading shadow maps. We thought we solved it at the end, but I'm not too sure about that. And the last thing here is that the long draw distances in heroes, we have a draw distance of 8 or 10 kilometers in the game. This sort of technique is for games that have a draw distance of maybe 500 or a kilometre. And we have thousands of things casting shadows. We have thousands of trees and houses all casting dynamic shadows onto the world. So all in all, it was another technology that was probably not appropriate for the game ultimately, but we were stuck with this one. Engine and programming again. I think I mentioned through the course of the talk that there was this blue sky attitude that led the team to take on these technologies and to throw away what was effectively working code in the first game. So the first thing they did was throw away all of the cool things that actually made the game, and then spent the next 1 or 2 years recreating those. And even at alpha, when all of these things were meant to be back in the game, we still found that half of the features that have been re-implemented weren't final and needed more work. The game spent 2 years being less functional than its prequel, which was terrible for it because you couldn't play it. Nobody could actually play it to make the game and to test it and see if all the ideas were working properly. Okay, so moving away from the tech side, I think they've had enough for the moment. The art production on Heroes, this is the next thing that went wrong, was too manpower intensive. Basically, only minor artwork was outsourced. The 2 things in the game that were outsourced were cockpits for planes, which we dropped ultimately, and landmark buildings, and some other buildings in there, and maybe some vehicles and stuff. Planes and terrains were all done in-house, and these were incredibly manpower intensive to build. Planes, for example, on Heroes of the Pacific, planes cost us about 3 weeks to build. On Heroes over Europe, they cost us 8 weeks to build for each individual plane. On Heroes of the Pacific, we built 36 planes, and all up we had 80 variations on those planes. We basically take a model and we put different textures on it, we'd get a whole new plane. It's a Spitfire Mark II instead of a Spitfire Mark I. And on the back of the box you can write, this game has 80 planes in it instead of 30 or whatever. On Heroes of Europe, we built only 26 base planes, with only 42 variations. So we had half the number of planes to the user that Heroes of the Pacific had. Basically, we should have outsourced the planes, but it's one of those things. It would have been cheaper, we would have had more of them, and we would have been able to use